He thought she didn't belong in that boutique, but in less than an hour, he would realize he had just humiliated the wrong woman. The glass doors of the boutique opened with a soft chime as Emily Carter stepped inside, her worn white sneakers barely making a sound against the polished marble floors that reflected chandeliers worth more than most people's cars. And for a brief moment, no one noticed her, not because she was invisible, but because she didn't fit the picture they were used to seeing. Her jeans were simple, her cardigan slightly faded, her hair tied back in a loose, practical knot, and yet her eyes were steady, calm, almost observant in a way that suggested she was taking in more than anyone realized. A sales associate glanced at her, then quickly looked away, choosing instead to greet a woman draped in designer labels who had just walked in behind her. And that was the first shift in the air, subtle but deliberate, the kind that said without words, "You don't belong here." Emily moved slowly through the boutique, her fingers brushing lightly against a silk dress, the fabric soft and impossibly smooth. And for a second, she allowed herself a quiet smile, not of longing, but of recognition, as if she understood the craftsmanship more than the price tag. Across the room, whispers began to form, quiet enough to seem private, but loud enough to be heard. Probably just browsing. One voice murmured, followed by a soft, dismissive chuckle, and still, Emily said nothing, her posture unchanged, her expression composed, as if she had heard it all before. Then came the sound of heels, sharp and deliberate, cutting through the soft instrumental music playing overhead, and Sophia Blake, the boutique manager, approached with a smile that never reached her eyes, polished, practiced, and cold. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone polite on the surface but edged with something else, something that made nearby conversations quiet just enough for people to listen. Emily turned to her, meeting her gaze without hesitation. "I'm looking for a dress," she said simply, her voice calm, measured, unshaken. Sophia's eyes flicked briefly over Emily's outfit, taking in every detail with a speed that came from years of judgment, and then she smiled again, thinner this time, sharper. "Our pieces start at around $3,000, she said, just loud. Enough for others to hear, and a few heads turned, curiosity mixing with quiet amusement. The room shifted, the atmosphere tightening like a held breath, and Emily paused for just a fraction of a second before nodding gently. "I understand," she replied, her voice still steady, still calm, and in that moment, something about her composure felt almost out of place, like she wasn't reacting the way Sophia expected. But Sophia had already made her decision, and with a small gesture toward the door, she said, "I think you'll be more comfortable elsewhere," the words landing softly, but carrying the weight of dismissal. And just like that, the boutique fell silent, every eye subtly drawn to the scene, waiting to see how this would unfold, because sometimes the quietest moments are the ones just before everything changes. The words lingered in the air long after they were spoken, and for a brief moment, no one moved. Not the customers pretending to browse, not the staff frozen behind polished counters, not even Sophia herself, who stood there expecting resistance, an argument, something that would justify the quiet tension she had just created. But Emily simply looked at her, her expression unchanged, her eyes steady in a way that made the silence feel heavier than any confrontation could have, and then she gave a small nod, almost polite, as if she had just been given directions rather than dismissed from a place that measured worth by appearances. "All right," she said softly, her voice carrying just enough to be heard, and without another word, she turned toward the door. The marble floors echoed faintly beneath her steps, each one calm, unhurried, and as she reached for the glass handle, the reflection staring back at her was not one of embarrassment, but of quiet clarity, the kind that comes from understanding exactly what had just happened and choosing not to fight it in that moment. Behind her, a few whispers resumed, softer now, uncertain, as if even those who had watched felt something shift that they could not quite explain, and Sophia exhaled slowly, straightening her posture, satisfied on the surface, yet unsettled in a way she could not name. Outside, the late afternoon air carried a light breeze, cool against Emily's face as she stepped onto the sidewalk, the city moving on as if nothing had occurred, cars passing, people talking, the world continuing without pause, and she stood there for a second, not rushing, not reacting, simply breathing in the moment before reaching into her bag and pulling out her phone. Her fingers hovered briefly over the screen. Then she made a call, lifting it to her ear with the same composed motion she had carried inside, and when the line connected, her voice remained even, almost gentle. "Hi. It is me," she said, a faint warmth touching her tone now. "I stopped by the boutique we talked about." There was a pause as she listened, her gaze drifting back toward the glass doors, where silhouettes moved behind reflections of light, and then she added quietly, "No, it is fine. I will handle it later." She ended the call without urgency, slipping the phone back into her bag, and for a moment, she simply stood there, her posture relaxed, her expression unreadable to anyone passing by, as if the situation had already resolved itself in a way no one else could see. Across the street, a black SUV rolled slowly through traffic before disappearing around the corner, unnoticed, its presence fleeting, almost insignificant in that instant. And Emily turned away from the boutique without looking back, her steps carrying her down the sidewalk with the same quiet confidence, leaving behind a space that felt different now, though no one inside could yet explain why, because sometimes the most powerful shifts begin not with noise, but with silence, and inside that boutique, something had just been set in motion that would not stay hidden for long. Inside the boutique, the atmosphere never fully returned to normal after she left. Even though the soft music continued, and the chandeliers still cast their warm glow across racks of carefully arranged clothing, there was a subtle shift that lingered, like a question no one wanted to ask out loud. And Sophia felt it most, though she refused to acknowledge it, adjusting a display with precise movements that were just slightly sharper than before, her mind replaying the moment again and again, searching for confirmation that she had done the right thing, that she had protected the image of the store, because in her world, perception was everything. A young sales associate approached cautiously, her voice hesitant. "Do you think she was actually going to buy something?" And Sophia barely glanced at her, offering a dismissive smile that felt more forced than confident. "People who can afford this place do not walk in dressed like that," she replied, her tone firm, as if stating a fact rather than a belief. And yet the associate nodded slowly without conviction, glancing toward the door as if expecting something, or someone, to return. Minutes passed, then more, and customers resumed their browsing, though their conversations remained quieter than before, as if the boutique itself had absorbed what had happened and was still deciding how to respond. And Sophia moved through the space with renewed authority, greeting clients, offering recommendations, maintaining the illusion of control that had defined her career. But control is fragile when it is built on assumptions. And outside, the city continued its steady rhythm until, almost exactly 1 hour later, a low, smooth engine sound approached, subtle at first, then unmistakable, the kind of sound that did not demand attention but commanded it anyway. Through the boutique's tall glass windows, reflections shifted as a sleek black SUV pulled up directly in front of the entrance, its polished surface catching the light in a way that turned heads without effort, and conversations inside slowed, then stopped, as if the entire room had sensed something significant before understanding why. The vehicle came to a precise stop, and for a brief second, nothing happened, no doors opening, no movement, just a quiet presence that seemed to hold the space in place. And then the driver's door opened, followed by the rear passenger door, smooth and deliberate, and a man stepped out, his suit tailored perfectly, his posture calm yet unmistakably authoritative, the kind of presence that did not need to announce itself to be recognized. A few customers exchanged glances, curiosity flickering into something sharper, recognition beginning to form, and one of the sales associates whispered under her breath, her eyes widening slightly, "Is that?" But she did not finish the sentence, because the realization was already spreading, faster than words could carry it. Sophia turned toward the entrance, her expression composed at first, professional, ready to greet what she assumed was an important client. But as her eyes landed on the man approaching the door, something in her posture shifted, almost imperceptibly, a tightening, a pause, as if her instincts had recognized something her mind had not yet processed. And when the glass doors opened once more with that same soft chime, the room fell into a silence so complete it felt almost intentional, because sometimes The moment before the truth reveals itself is the quietest moment of all. The man did not rush as he stepped inside, and that alone was enough to shift the balance of the room. Because people who needed attention often moved quickly, but those who commanded it moved with calm precision, and every step he took across the marble floor echoed softly, measured, deliberate, as if he already knew exactly where he was going and why he was there. Conversations had stopped entirely now, replaced by a quiet tension that seemed to settle into the walls themselves, and the sales associates who had once whispered now stood still, watching, their earlier confidence replaced with something uncertain, something cautious. Sophia straightened instinctively, smoothing her blazer, her practiced smile returning as she stepped forward to greet him, her voice polished and warm. "Welcome to our boutique. How may I assist you today?" But even as she spoke, there was a slight hesitation, a flicker in her eyes that betrayed the unease building beneath her composure. The man's gaze moved across the room briefly, not hurried, not searching, but observing, as if taking in every detail without needing to linger, and then his eyes settled on Sophia, steady and unreadable, and for a moment, he said nothing, allowing the silence to stretch just long enough to make the air feel heavier than before. One of the customers near the display table leaned slightly toward another, whispering under her breath, recognizing him now. The realization spreading quietly from one person to the next like a ripple across still water, and Sophia felt it, that shift, that unspoken awareness moving through the room, even before she understood its meaning. "I believe you already assisted my wife earlier," the man said finally, his voice calm, low, and controlled, yet carrying clearly through the silence, and the words landed with a weight that seemed to stop time itself, because in that single sentence, everything began to connect in a way that could not be undone. Sophia blinked, just once, her expression tightening for the smallest fraction of a second before she recovered. "I am sorry. I am not sure I understand," she replied, though her voice was no longer as steady as before, and the room remained completely still. Every eye now fixed on the exchange unfolding in front of them. The man took a single step closer, not aggressive, not confrontational, but purposeful, and his presence seemed to fill the space without effort. "A woman in jeans and white sneakers," he continued, his tone unchanged. "She was here about an hour ago." The words were simple, but the silence that followed them was not, because now there was no room for misunderstanding, no space left for assumption, only the quiet, undeniable truth beginning to surface. Behind Sophia, one of the younger associates lowered her gaze, her earlier uncertainty now turning into something closer to realization, and Sophia's posture shifted again, almost imperceptibly, as if the foundation of her certainty had just been challenged in a way she could not immediately recover from. "Yes," she said carefully, choosing her words with precision. "I did speak with someone earlier." But even as she spoke, the confidence she had relied on moments before felt distant, replaced by a growing awareness that whatever was about to happen next would not follow the script she had always controlled. And in that moment, the boutique, once defined by status and appearance, felt smaller, quieter, as if it were waiting for something it could not stop. The silence did not break immediately. It stretched, heavy and deliberate, as if the room itself understood that whatever came next would redefine everything that had just happened, and the man's gaze never left Sophia's face, not with anger, not with hostility, but with a calm clarity that felt far more unsettling than any raised voice ever could have been. Sophia forced a small smile, the kind she had perfected over years of dealing with demanding clients. But this time it did not hold. "If there was any misunderstanding, I am sure we can resolve it," she said, her tone carefully measured, though a faint tightness had crept into her voice, betraying the control she was trying to maintain. The man tilted his head slightly, not in confusion, but in quiet acknowledgement, as if he had already heard every explanation she might offer before she spoke it. She was not confused, he replied evenly. She was dismissed. The words were simple, but they landed with precision, cutting through the air without force, yet leaving no room for interpretation, and a subtle shift moved through the room as those watching felt the weight of what had just been said. Behind Sophia, one of the associates took a small step back, her earlier uncertainty now replaced with clear discomfort, her eyes lowering as the memory of the moment replayed in her mind from a different perspective, one that no longer felt harmless. Sophia's posture straightened again, though this time it felt more rigid than confident. "We have standards here," she said, her voice slightly firmer, as if leaning on familiar ground. "We try to maintain a certain environment for our clientele." And as the words left her mouth, they sounded different than they had an hour ago, less certain, less justified, as if even she could hear the fragility beneath them. The man nodded slowly, acknowledging her statement without agreeing with it. And for a brief second, he glanced around the boutique, at the polished displays, the carefully arranged racks, the silent audience now witnessing something they had not expected when they walked in, and then his gaze returned to her, steady as before. "An environment built on respect," he said quietly, his tone unchanged. "Or on assumption?" The question lingered, not raised as an accusation, but as something far more difficult to answer, because it required reflection rather than defense, and the room remained completely still, no one daring to interrupt, no one willing to break the tension that had settled into every corner of the space. Sophia opened her mouth to respond, but for the first time, no immediate answer came, and that pause, that brief moment of uncertainty, was enough to reveal what words could not hide, and in that instant, the balance of the room shifted completely, because control had quietly moved from one side to the other without a single raised voice, and everyone present could feel it, even if they could not yet explain why. The question did not demand an answer, but it demanded something far more difficult, honesty, and Sophia felt it pressing in from all sides, not from the man standing in front of her, but from the silence behind her, from the eyes of the customers who had watched the earlier moment unfold, from the staff who now avoided her gaze, and for the first time since she had taken control of that boutique floor, she hesitated in a way that could not be hidden. "We maintain a standard," she repeated, though the words sounded weaker now, as if they no longer carried the certainty they once had, and the man observed her quietly, not interrupting, not correcting, simply allowing the space to reveal itself. He reached into his jacket slowly, his movements calm and unhurried, and when he pulled out a small, understated card, it was not flashed or presented with drama, but held between his fingers with quiet intention before he extended it toward her. Sophia glanced at it, her hand pausing for just a fraction of a second before taking it, and the moment her eyes settled on the name, the shift was immediate, subtle to anyone not watching closely, but unmistakable to those who were. The color in her face changed slightly, her posture tightening, her breath catching just enough to betray the realization forming in her mind, because the name printed on that card was not unfamiliar. It was the kind of name that appeared in business journals, in investment reports, in conversations about ownership and influence, and suddenly, the situation she thought she controlled no longer belonged to her. Around the room, the tension deepened, curiosity turning into quiet understanding as a few customers recognized it as well, their expressions shifting from interest to awareness, and the earlier whispers were replaced with complete silence. Sophia looked up again, her voice softer now. "Careful, Mr. Carter," she said, the title coming more naturally than she expected, as if acknowledging something she could not ignore, and for the first time, there was no trace of condescension left in her tone. The man nodded once, not acknowledging the title, but not rejecting it either. "I prefer Daniel," he replied simply, his voice unchanged, still calm, still controlled, and somehow that made the moment even more unsettling, because there was no escalation, no display of power, only quiet certainty. Sophia swallowed, her earlier confidence now replaced with something closer to unease. "If there has been a mistake, I assure you, we can make this right," she said, choosing her words carefully. But even as she spoke, the balance of the conversation had already shifted beyond repair. Daniel glanced briefly around the boutique again, taking in the details, the silence, the people who had witnessed everything, and then his eyes returned to her, steady and clear. "This was never about a mistake," he said, his tone even. "It was about a decision." And those words settled into the room like a truth no one could avoid, because a mistake can be corrected, but a decision reveals something deeper, something far more difficult to change. And in that moment, everyone in the boutique understood that what had happened earlier was no longer just an incident. It had become something else entirely. The words settled into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, and for a moment, it felt as if time itself had slowed, stretching the silence into something almost tangible. And Sophia stood there holding the card, her fingers tightening slightly around its edges as the meaning of what he had said continued to unfold in her mind. Because a decision could not be undone with an apology alone, and she knew it. "I understand," she said finally, though her voice carried a quiet strain now, no longer polished, no longer effortless, and the shift was unmistakable to everyone watching, because the authority she once held in that space had begun to slip, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably. Daniel studied her for a brief moment, not with judgment, but with a calm awareness that seemed to see beyond her words. And then he glanced toward the entrance, where the glass doors reflected the fading daylight, and as if on cue, they opened once more with that same soft chime. Heads turned again, slower this time, almost cautiously, as Emily Carter stepped back inside, her presence as quiet as before, her posture unchanged, her expression steady, and yet everything about how she was perceived had shifted completely. The same sneakers, the same cardigan, the same calm eyes, but now the room reacted differently, because now they understood what they had failed to see earlier. Sophia's gaze moved instantly to her, and for a brief second, she froze, caught between the memory of how she had treated her and the reality of who she now knew her to be, and that hesitation, that pause, spoke louder than any apology could have. Emily walked forward at the same measured pace, her steps soft against the marble, her gaze briefly meeting Daniel's, and in that glance, there was no drama, no need for explanation, only quiet understanding, as if everything that needed to be said had already been said without words. The staff who had once whispered now stood still, their earlier assumptions replaced with something closer to discomfort, their eyes lowering as Emily passed, and the customers who had watched from a distance now observed with a different kind of attention, one shaped not by curiosity, but by realization. Daniel turned slightly toward Emily, his voice softening just enough to reflect something personal beneath his composed exterior. "Are you all right?" he asked, and she gave a small nod, her expression calm. "I am fine," she replied simply, her tone steady, unshaken, and in that moment, it became clear that whatever had happened earlier had not diminished her, but revealed something about everyone else instead. Daniel looked back at Sophia, his expression unchanged, but the weight of the moment now carried a different clarity, because the person who had been dismissed now stood in the same space, unchanged in appearance, but completely transformed in the eyes of those around her, and the room fell silent once more, not from tension this time, but from something deeper, something closer to recognition, because sometimes, the most powerful revelations are not about who someone becomes, but about who they were all along. No one spoke at first, because the moment did not allow for interruption, it demanded stillness, and Sophia stood there facing Emily, the weight of her earlier decision now fully visible in a way it had not been before, no longer hidden behind assumptions or routine, but exposed in the quiet space between them, and for the first time, she did not immediately reach for words, because she understood that whatever she said now would not erase what had already been done. Emily's gaze remained steady, not confrontational, not cold, but clear in a way that made avoidance impossible, and she did not step forward to reclaim space or demand acknowledgement. She simply stood there as she had before, unchanged, and that was what made the moment so difficult to ignore. Sophia finally inhaled, a subtle breath that seemed louder in the silence than it should have been, and when she spoke, her voice was different, stripped of the sharpness it once carried. "I owe you an apology," she said, each word measured, careful, and for a brief second, it seemed as if the entire room leaned into that moment, waiting to see if it would be enough. Emily listened without interruption, her expression calm, her posture relaxed, and when Sophia finished, there was a pause, not of hesitation, but of consideration, as if Emily understood the difference between words spoken out of obligation and those that came from something deeper. "I appreciate that," Emily replied quietly, her tone even, but there was no immediate acceptance, no quick resolution, only acknowledgement, and that distinction settled into the space between them with quiet clarity. Daniel observed the exchange without stepping in, allowing it to unfold naturally, because this moment did not belong to him. It belonged to Emily, and the power of it came not from authority, but from presence. Sophia's hands remained still at her sides, no longer gesturing, no longer directing, and for the first time since she had approached Emily earlier that day, she seemed uncertain not about what to say, but about what she represented in that moment. "We should have treated you differently," she added, her voice softer now, more honest, and this time, there was no performance in it, only recognition, and the room remained silent, not out of tension, but out of respect for the shift taking place. Emily glanced briefly around the boutique, at the displays, the staff, the customers who had witnessed everything, and then her eyes returned to Sophia, steady as before. "You should treat everyone that way," she said simply, and the words landed without force, yet carried a weight that no one could dismiss, because they were not directed at one person, but at everyone present. The silence that followed was different now, no longer heavy, but reflective, as if the room itself had absorbed the meaning of what had just been said, and Sophia lowered her gaze slightly, not in defeat, but in acknowledgement, understanding that the lesson she had just been given was not one she could ignore or undo, only carry forward. And in that moment, the boutique no longer felt like a place defined by status or appearance, but like a space where something unseen had shifted, something that would not easily be forgotten. The room did not return to what it had been before, even as the soft music resumed, and the gentle lighting continued to cast its warm glow across the boutique. Something had changed in a way that could not be undone, and everyone present could feel it, not as tension, but as awareness. Sophia stood still for a moment longer, her posture no longer rigid, no longer defined by control, but by reflection, and then she moved, slowly, deliberately, turning toward her staff with a quiet composure that carried a different kind of authority, one shaped not by assumption, but by realization. The associates who had once whispered now avoided her gaze, not out of fear, but out of understanding, and the silence among them spoke louder than any instruction she could give. Daniel remained beside Emily, not stepping forward, not asserting presence, simply standing there with the same calm certainty that had defined him from the moment he entered, and for a brief moment, he looked at Emily again, his expression softening in a way that only she seemed to notice, a quiet acknowledgement that everything that needed to happen had already unfolded. Emily turned slightly, her eyes moving across the boutique once more, not with judgment, not with resentment, but with a quiet clarity that seemed to see the space for what it truly was, not a place defined by price tags or appearances, but by the choices of the people within it. And then she took a step toward the display she had paused at earlier, her hand once again brushing lightly against the fabric of the same dress. Her touch as gentle and unassuming as before. This time, no one interrupted her, no one questioned her presence, and the difference was not in who she was, but in what they now understood. Sophia approached again, more carefully this time, her voice steady but softer. "If you would still like to see that piece, I would be happy to assist you," she said, and there was no pretense in her tone now, only sincerity, and Emily looked at her for a brief moment before offering a small nod, a simple acknowledgement that did not erase the past, but allowed something new to exist in its place. The boutique remained quiet as Sophia carefully retrieved the dress, presenting it without flourish, without assumption, and for the first time, the interaction felt balanced, not defined by status, but by respect. Around them, customers resumed their movements, though their expressions carried something more thoughtful than before, as if they had witnessed more than just an exchange, but a shift in perspective that would follow them beyond those walls. Daniel glanced once more around the room, taking in the subtle changes, and then his gaze returned to Emily, who now stood examining the dress with the same calm attention she had shown from the beginning, unchanged by circumstance, unchanged by perception. And as the moment settled into something quieter, something steadier, it became clear that nothing about Emily had ever needed to change, only the way she had been seen, because sometimes the world does not shift when someone reveals who they are, it shifts when others finally learn how to see it. And in that boutique, on that quiet afternoon, That lesson would remain long after the doors closed and the lights dimmed. A silent reminder that dignity does not announce itself. It is simply there, waiting to be recognized.